Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government and the future. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety, and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do.
Welcome back to AI, Government in the Future. I'm your host, Mark Lay, and today I'm honored to have Wendell Wallach join us on the show. Wendell is a prominent bioethicist and a leading voice in the ethics and governance of emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence and neuroscience. He held the position of Carnegie Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, where he co-directed the AI Inequality Initiative. Wendell also served for over 2 decades as the chair of the Technology and Ethics Research Group at Yale University's Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, where he now serves as emeritus chair. With influential works like Moral Machines and A Dangerous Master, Wendell has long explored the ethical challenges posed by rapidly evolving technologies and how global governance frameworks can respond to them. Today, we'll be diving into the complex landscape of global governance, focusing on how nations and institutions can collaborate to responsibly regulate AI while fostering innovation. Welcome to the show, Wendell. It's great to have you on.
Thank you very much, Mark. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. So, Wendell, you've spent over 2 decades at the forefront of bioethics and the governance of emerging technologies. Can you share with us what initially drew you to the intersection of ethics and technology, particularly in fields like AI and neuroscience?
So let me take you back a little bit because I've lived a very idiosyncratic life, and I'm well beyond those 2 decades in the kinds of work I've done. But I really go back to pretty much being a 60s person, an activist. I got interested in Eastern religions and spent a few years doing meditation and relief work in India. I started a computer consulting company. And when I was finishing up with all of that around 2001, in fact, I got into a computer consulting company because I had books in my head that I wanted to get out. And I hated whiteout, and I hated, the tools that were available at the time. But I got into microcomputers because they actually gave me word processing. They gave me correction ability. And I was very early in the microcomputer industry also, so they became these fun tools that you could actually study anything with or do anything with. And so that wrapped up around the year 2001 for me, and I felt it was time to move on, and I actually hadn't gotten these books out of my head. That's what really frustrated me. But I realized that a few things had happened in the intervening years. One of them was a cognitive science, this amalgamation of computer science and neuroscience and anthropology and many other fields had become a robust field. It was just coming into being back when I was a student. And the other interesting thing was that computers were now starting to become viable. There were a lot of people who were looking at emerging technologies, and particularly nanotechnology, the ability to engineer on the level of molecules and subatomic particles and so forth was drawing a great deal of fascination. So there was actually a world to move into. There were different people who were into these fields. I would say there were 2 main groups. One were the academics, who were pretty much focused on nanotechnology, largely because the government had put billions of dollars into nanotech and had put aside, it's confusing whether it was 3% or 0.3% and what actually found its way, but some of that money actually found its way into academia to study ethical issues around nanotech. But the other thing was the emergence of this community of transhumanists or extropians, people who were very interested in moving into a new world where they would be transhuman in the sense that they would merge with technologies, perhaps they would live forever. I think most of your audience will at least be familiar with a lot of these technologies and thoughts are. But they were actually among the first people that I became involved with soon after I got involved with the Technology and Ethics Study Group at Yale, because they were the people running that Technology and Ethics Study Group at Yale. At that time, Nick Bostrom was a well-known name to many people, and Jay Hughes. They were launching the World Transhumanist Association, and they had a particular investment in people being able to move into experimenting with and taking on these new technologies without government getting in the way. And that was probably the driving force at that point. That was probably the driving force behind most of the ethics at that point, in the sense that the ethical discussion was largely around how do we keep the conservatives from mucking up our ability to be transhumanists. And there was also a great deal of, what shall I say, hype and enthusiasm and naivete about how quickly these technologies would come along, which has been a long-standing story in technology development going back to the 1956ers who created the field of artificial intelligence and even coined the word. It's always this overestimation of what would happen. But in the early 2000s, the transhumanists all expected that we would have super intelligent computers and nanoengineering and neural links between our brain and computer systems and little nano machines running through our blood vessels, delivering various drugs and so forth to differing subsystems. And of course, genetic engineering. As you may remember, that was right about the time that we had deciphered or were finishing up the deciphering of the human genome, and the question of whether biotechnologies could create new organs, could create new entities in new ways, new species, and what it would mean to be introducing them into our body, into the environment around them. So that was the environment I moved into. There was no AI ethics per se. In fact, I'm sometimes spoken of as one of the godfathers of AI ethics, because I did some seminal things that contributed to what we now as a full-fledged field. And if there's one success, I would say it's nice that we're talking about ethics so rigorously when we're talking about AI. Because that wasn't what most people cared about. They cared about what the technologies were and how you tamper down any desire to over-regulate them. And that was true in nanotechnology also. In nanotechnology, it was fascinating that there was money early on to address some of the ethical challenges and governance challenges that came up. But it's not as if there were that many pressing ethical and governance challenges. The most pressing one that came up would be in synthetic biology, which was sometimes tagged together with nanotechnology, but that was that we would invent new species that would be introduced into environments and in some cases cause the actual collapse of those environments, regardless of what the so-called benefit of that particular species was going to be. So that's right where we were for quite a few years. For myself, I had been involved in ethical concerns my whole life, really. I mean, going back to the civil rights movement as a high school student, activism during my college years in the 60s, and it goes on and on and on. So my activism and my ethics were kind of always there. They were always part of who I was and what I was about. But it wasn't so clear to me with this vast field of emerging technologies what I would do with it or what I could focus on. And I came to focus on what eventually became Moral Machines Teaching Robots Right from Wrong, which was, can we develop artificially intelligent systems that are sensitive to ethical dilemmas and factor them into their choices and actions? And if so, what would be the roadways to do that?
I think following up on that, I mean, obviously you've worked on a variety of different governance frameworks domestically, internationally, within academia, focused on different classes of emerging technology. I guess at a high level, could you elaborate on what's the purpose of these governance frameworks? What problems or questions do these frameworks that you've contributed to, what are they trying to solve or address? And how do those frameworks support technology advancement from your perspective?
So they've come to try and develop or support a vast array of issues. In AI alone, you're going to see AI systems being introduced into every realm of human endeavor. So the AI systems being introduced into healthcare, there is a healthcare code of ethics there. There are the principles of AI ethics in medical research and in medical experimentation and so forth. So they're going to have to accommodate those. But that's very different than what's going on in, let's say, AI in the military, where you're dealing with issues of lethal autonomous weapons and deployment of systems that may act in ways that you can't fully anticipate. And we could go on that subject alone, but I'm not going to. I'm just trying to get across that we're dealing with a vast array of ethical issues because we're dealing with a vast array of contexts in which these systems can be introduced. And AI systems are also turning into the driver, the amplifier of research in every other field of study. So that overlaps into other issues that come around. The obvious ones and the earlier ones concerns surrounded data protection. And that's already been a big issue in medical ethics. It's how do we ensure the anonymity of people who are being researched. And of course, when you get into data ethics for AI, we're now dealing with a vast array of data that needs different kinds of protection depending upon what the data is and who you're trying to protect it from or who you're trying to secure. But very early on in artificial intelligence, it became clear that there was some ethical concerns that were very explicitly AI oriented. So that was about data security, that was about fairness in the distribution and the availability of the technologies, that was about transparency in how the technologies made their decisions, and that was about responsibility. Who would be responsible for the deployment of these systems, particularly if these systems in some situations would be acting in ways that couldn't be anticipated. So that was the early framework for the way most people were thinking about ethics. And it was really that, and it was then this other side about what could the AI systems contribute in the way they were designed to ensure that their activity was more ethical. And that was a very early part that took us into, let's say, about 2012 and 2016 when things started to change dramatically.
Yeah. And I guess a quick follow-up question on that, from your perspective, are, governance frameworks or ethical frameworks for AI applications, are they inherently context dependent, or are there universal kind of best practices or signifiers of an effective AI governance framework, regardless of context or application?
So let me put that in the historical context, okay? Because what happened in 2012 to 2016 is what created this rash of projects that were trying to create principles for the development of AI and these different sets of principles. What happened in 2012 was really the discovery of what we now know as deep learning. And up to that time, we can argue about whether AI existed in any form at all, or whether this was all just kind of sophisticated programming that was going into systems. Deep learning changed things a bit because suddenly deep learning was able to do things that we had failed abysmally for 50 years. In particular, labeling the objects in a photograph was, an example of that. The long-standing problem that nobody could do that supposedly we were going to be able to do within a decade of 1956, and of course did not really come along until about 2012. So the deep learning revolution concatenated over a few years and brought in many of the best researchers. And by roughly 2016, it was starting to become the belief that deep learning was taking us very quickly on the course of creating artificial general intelligence, artificial intelligence that would have all of human mental capabilities, and very soon after that, artificial superintelligence, which was at least being hyped or labeled by many of the key people as being potentially one of the greatest benefits, but also one of the greatest things that could go wrong in humanity's history and could perhaps wipe us out. So that led to the Future of Life Institute to convene a first gathering around those questions in 2016. And they basically brought 89 people together in Puerto Rico, which included all the key people within artificial intelligence at that time. I'm not saying there weren't tens of thousands of researchers, but pretty much all the names you would know showed up at that event. And there was a few outliers like myself who were invited, to represent ethics and law and hiring and, the effect of AI and employment. So that sort of launched everything, and that launched a whole concern around particularly artificial general intelligence, which was scaring the bejesus out of everybody. And suddenly groups left and right were jumping into the space because they wanted to put together guidelines for what was and what was not acceptable in AI. And they came back down with, there may have been more than 200 groups in the end that put together these lists, but the most important ones came out of UNESCO and also out of the OECD. And there was also a list that came out of a Beijing list of principles, which was pretty much like all of the ones coming out of the West, except that they didn't use human rights or protection of human rights as one of the concerns. But these lists are all relatively similar. They all touch upon the AI-specific problems, meaning transparency and accountability, but they all went beyond that. They all talked about. So what I saw this as was the first opportunity that people were beginning to think about, well, what kind of future do we want to create? And therefore, they started adding the other principles, such as protection of human rights, as a way of kind of fleshing out what kind of world we should be creating. So those became broad principles that are pretty much in place. How functional they are when you get down to specifics is something else, but at least those normative principles give people kind of parameters for the space in which you should be working. And if you violate those principles, either that's an exception or you should have a damn good reason why you're doing that.
Well, and for the listeners, I think you'd spoken about, artificial general intelligence versus artificial superintelligence. Is there a key, differentiator between those two terms from your point of view?
There's not a key differentiator, and the terms have been around for a long time. And now as people think that we are drawing nearer at least to artificial general intelligence, they're trying to get into more specificity about how they use that term. So there are people who want to claim that the large language models you have right now, like ChatGPT, that they're starting to exemplify certain characteristics of artificial general intelligence, which is part of the hype machine that says, therefore, artificial general intelligence is very close, even though there may be actually some gaping holes that make it clear that we're still some distance from artificial general intelligence. Artificial superintelligence is vastly superior to humans in all respects. And whether that would come soon after artificial general intelligence depends upon two things. One, how you define artificial and general intelligence, because some people, I think, are are ready to accept pretty stupid definitions right now just so they can hype what we have. And other people say, no, artificial general intelligence requires much more sophistication than what we're seeing. But then once you have artificial general intelligence, then you move into a realm where the computer systems can concatenate on top of each other, and you may have what was referred to as an intelligence explosion, where suddenly the realm of intelligence expands very quickly.
We often on this podcast try to contextualize, current events or advancements related to AI technology development, policy development, or ethical framework development for public sector applications or government agency positioning. So, Wendell, from your standpoint, are there certain roles or data governance requirements that public sector organizations need to prioritize into their operations, or need to just prioritize in general in terms of guiding without inhibiting AI application innovation?
They need to regulate it much more, and they need to get into the weeds and think through what are the different applications and what kind of constraints should be on those applications. And they should understand that this whole artificial general intelligence and artificial superintelligence is a conversation for nerds. It's hype and it creates fear, but that fear often serves a purpose, which is saying you should be investing billions of dollars into this. This is the most important thing in the world today. And I would say I'm among those who think if those are even possible, they're further away than is represented. Yet where we are right now is the adoption of a wide array of AI systems in different contexts. And each of those has its own specific concerns, and each of those has standards that need to be put in place, compliance regulations that need to be put in place, oversight bodies to ensure that the standards and compliance has been met. And if there are breakthroughs that we think open the door to much greater concerns, then we are monitoring where we are relative to those breakthroughs and how we should be responding should those breakthroughs occur. Obviously, in technology development and in science and experimentation more generally, we don't always know where the breakthroughs are going to be. There's so many things going on in research labs that we'd be dumbfounded if we presumed that even 50% of those were going to be realized in terms of what kind of world we were opening the doors to. But I think there are some specific challenges that say that AI is dangerous in the sense that it might be able to make decisions that we were not even cognizant that it would be making. So those will require breakthroughs that we don't have yet. That problem is more likely to occur in the present context because you've introduced a little AI control system into, let's say, electrical grids or fuel grids or something like that, and it did something that you didn't realize it could do, and it created a crisis. That's more where we are right now. It's this introduction of AI into different realms without thinking through the ramifications of I'm particularly concerned with what goes wrong, because I'm pretty sure that what goes right is going to get championed without people like me pointing out that there's this problematic or that problematic.
Yeah. And you described a lot of kind of requirements for how government agencies can begin designing, governance frameworks for AI that balance innovation or, performance gains like, automated control of certain elements of a public utility with ethical or just general risk concerns.
We should say there are non-general risk concerns too. There are impacts on society that are not necessarily technical or that haven't been the kind that regulatory agencies have dealt with that we have to be deeply concerned about. So the question of whether AI is going to create vast unemployment or at least destroy a significant segment of jobs. That's not a technical issue, but it is a societal concern.
My next question would be, in order to make progress towards developing effective governance frameworks that kind of encourage thoughtful rollout of AI supported applications, what would be your recommended first steps? Understanding, I heard you describe, it's important to understand how AI capabilities support how a government agency or any organization conducts its business. Maybe just doing a traditional risk analysis, looking at, job loss or economic impacts associated with the rollout of AI. But Wendell, from your perspective, are there any, near-term actions that organizations can pursue now to understand some of these impacts?
Well, frankly, I think one of the nearest terms is vast education on what these technologies are and what their implications are in your realm of activity. So, I mean, I would like to see grammar school students and high school students learning about how to identify a deep fake, or how to identify misinformation, or how to identify a scam, along with a basic technical understanding of what the tools are and what some of the possibilities might be, or what internet hygiene would be. But at the government level, we have a deep problematic, and it's most problematic in the United States, and that's corporate capture. And corporate capture, along with what I say will be the cult of innovation, has created this political situation where tampering with innovation is the worst thing you can do. And if you tamper with innovation, all you're doing is allowing the Chinese to leapfrog us in this, what I say, race to God knows where. And the systems are very complex, so the corporations feel quite free to say, well, we'll take care of the regulations. You can't really understand what you're doing, and therefore you don't understand when you're introducing some kind of restraint that will also slow down innovation. And we know that the Chinese aren't going to do the same thing, which isn't true, by the way. This narrative that gets created within political circles within the United States. So leave regulation to the AI oligopoly. We have, by the way, no good history of corporate self-regulation, and I could go into that in another place. But leave it to the corporations to self-regulate. And by the way, here's $100,000 for your next reelection campaign. So what that has created is a situation where it's very hard in the U.S. to pass anything because confusion can be created. And in some senses, I would say the confusion is intentional. The confusion is intentional because these are power struggles we're dealing with. And though it's very nice that we're talking about regulation and ethics and so forth, the question is whether ethics, how much currency it has in terms of getting appropriate constraints put in place, and which realm it could have. We could have appropriate constraints.
In terms of what are some of the mechanisms that could be put in place to promote accountability while balancing, competitive positioning and demand for advanced AI tool innovation? Are there things that strike that balance perspective from a regulatory standpoint?
Yeah, I think that somebody is actually accountable. We have diluted accountability in the United States over the last 20 years. It doesn't seem like anybody is accountable for anything, or it's unusual when accountability really takes place. And the problem with emerging technologies is we don't always know why they act in the way they act. So it's very easy to hide behind the screen of saying, I didn't know that it could do that. But I think the question is that acceptable? Is it acceptable that you didn't know it could do that? And do you need to be doing more due diligence before you deploy a technology? So, for example, in the military, I'd either like to see a ban on the use of lethal autonomous weapons, or I would like to see something where someone in the command chain, probably higher up than lower down, is going to be held accountable if the system does not act in the way you had anticipated under the rules of engagement it would act. So that people are a little bit more cautious about when they deploy such systems. I'm not trying to stop, us from winning wars or acting upon situations in which there's a high probability of success. But the difficulty that you're dealing with artificial intelligence is these are probabilistic machines. So the problem with probabilistic machines is they have some actions that have a high probability of occurring, and they have other actions that have a low probability or long tail. And risk is traditionally determined by probability times impact. So even if you have a low probability that an AI would launch a nuclear weapon, if it not launches that nuclear weapon, that's going to have an impact far beyond the high probability that a drone will correctly pick off some terrorist or adversary that you have programmed into it. I don't think most of the military commanders even understand this. The ones who do are the older ones who tend to see artificial intelligence as lowering the culture of command and control, which has been central to military operations. So just in the military, if accountability were treated seriously again, I think that would enhance the decision-making process, but that also means you need sophisticated education for those who are going to deploy systems, particularly systems that could have a high impact in terms of the damage they could.
What I'm hearing is probably, an opportunity would be to bring common language or clear description of how AI capabilities are being used within specific contexts, and maybe an agreed upon and acknowledged understanding of the probability and various impacts, associated with kind of a malfunction or a negative scenario, would be a good step in the right direction.
So that's easy for you to say, but sit down with a bunch of people who really understand these fields and see if you can work through what the implementation of that would be. And I think this is probably the key point I want to make in this particular podcast, is the degree of governance that's needed is going to be vast. And we aren't even scratching the surface, largely because we're playing around with very early systems, and largely because we haven't wanted to engage in the governance of them. Europe, at least, is now at least starting to think of the governance, because they want to get in the way of the strength of being the innovators, or the early innovators in all that. The difficulty is we are talking about technologies that are going to be implemented all over the place in all kinds of contexts. They're going to be as ubiquitous as electricity. And think about electricity, which is essentially a lawfully performing technology. And think about the vastness of the infrastructure we have to ensure the safety of electricity. And we're talking about something on that scale for artificial intelligence, perhaps even more so because the applications become so diverse and the situations become so diverse. And right now, what we have is billions of dollars being put into making large language models bigger and bigger and bigger, and a pittance being put into AI safety and security. A lot of talk about AI safety and security, a lot of verbal commitment by the AI oligopolies that they are working in safety and security. They're putting next to nothing in those realms. And the history shows that they can't be relied upon to do so. Happy to go through an example of that if that would be helpful.
Yeah, no, I think the point's well taken. And I mean, I think that in addition to advocating for substantive investment of resources in AI safety and security, other recommendations you have for leaders within the public and private sector who are kind of grappling with the challenge of balancing innovation and responsible rollout of these tools?
I think there's got to be more deep diving, and I think there's got to be care about who's in the bodies who are doing the evaluation. I'm happy to see that a number of senators are developing a fairly sophisticated understanding of artificial intelligence. But when they talk with people, they aren't likely to talk with me. They're going to talk with Elon Musk, and they're going to talk with the heads of Google and Microsoft and so forth. And whether they have the intuitions to know what they can rely upon when those people talk and what they can't, I don't know. But I don't have the sense they do. So I think the kinds of bodies that have to come through to work through what might be the regulatory concerns becomes vast. So, for example, I'm part of a regulatory governance committee within the IEEE. And we're just creating a document for what governance, often within a business, a large or a small business or an NGO or perhaps a small government, needs to be thinking about. We've basically got 50 to 100 experts who've been working on this for 4 years. And it gets quite nuanced at different times. And it doesn't get down to the nitty-gritty of specific applications. It stays still on a relatively general level. The problem is, how are we going to bring together the mind-bending exercises with people you can trust? And how are we going to evaluate that their output can be trusted? And if their output can be trusted, will it be given any credence at all by regulatory bodies or by legislatures when they have to make decisions? So that's one of the things we need. And we need that on every level. It doesn't matter what the vertical platform you're dealing with, but we need it. We need it really seriously on the international level, because there are issues with AI that need global oversight. You don't need global oversight for everything. Yes, when you're trying to make electricity safe, then you have standards for gauges of wires or plugs or something like that. And we have international standards bodies like the IEEE and ISO that do that. So that's fine. We don't need that kind of oversight on the global level. But when we're talking about technologies that may be acting in ways that we can't fully control or anticipate, when we're talking about technologies that may be put in positions of responsibility that they really don't have the intelligence to handle correctly, when we're talking about technologies that are going to be universally exploited by bad actors or just politically motivated actors and lead to an epidemic of scams, you need international regulation. I've been recommending for the last year or more that, for example, we should actually have an international regulation against scams, against the use of technology for scams. And I'm happy to say that soon after I proposed that, the Pope also proposed that. But I haven't heard anything happen with it since he proposed it. And yet scams may not be touching everybody on the planet, but it's certainly touching a few billion people on the planet. And the amount of time we waste, the productivity we waste, the amount of fraud, the amount of identity theft, it's tragic. It's getting in the way of innovation and progress and productivity more than any regulations that the oligopoly, the IT oligopoly, is worried about.
What I'm hearing is maybe, investing some expertise in analyzing kind of the impacts of, negative uses of some of these tools is a worthwhile endeavor.
And investing significantly in creating the technological tools to defeat those.
Well said. Well, Wendell, I appreciate your time. I guess before we wrap up, are there any sources or platforms where listeners can go to check out more of your work?
Well, they're welcome to go to the carnegiecouncil.org. There's a lot of podcasts we've done under artificial intelligence and equality initiatives. There are early proposals we put in for what international governance or global governance of AI might look like, what its components might look like. So we brought together some of these workshops of experts to think through what would be key elements of effective international governance. So there's a bunch of papers on that. So that's a good place to start.
Great. Well, Wendell Wallach, thanks again for your time. And we look forward to monitoring your work and thought leadership on AI technology innovation and, ethical impacts and best practices moving forward. But thanks again for joining us here this afternoon. And we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.